In the summer of 1973, police in Huston, Texas began digging into a small boat shed. At first they expected to find one body, then another, teenage boys, buried side by side in the boiling Texas dirt, some still handcuffed, some wrapped in plastic, all connected to the same man, a quiet electrician who owned a candy factory, a man local kids called the Candyman. But what investigators uncovered inside his house was worse than anyone imagined. A torture board, ropes, handcuffs, and evidence suggesting this killer may have murdered far more than anyone would ever admit publicly, because even today, many believe the official victim count is only the beginning. And the most terrifying part? The killer never went to trial, because one of his teenage accomplices killed him first. This is the horrifying true story of Dean Corll. Huston in the early 1970s was exploding with growth. Families poured into the city, neighborhoods expanded overnight. Teenagers wandered freely through streets, parks, and parking lots with almost no supervision. It felt safe, at least on the surface, but hidden behind the noise of the growing city. One of the deadliest serial killers in American history was already hunting, and for years, nobody stopped him. Dean Arnold Corll was born in 1939. To neighbors, he seemed shy, quiet, almost awkward. Nothing about him screamed monster. As a teenager, he worked in his family's candy company. The business became locally famous for its sweets. Kids often gathered around the factory for free candy, and that's how Dean earned the nickname, the Candyman. At first, people saw him as generous, friendly, helpful, but behind the smile, something dark was growing. Former classmates later described strange behavior, mood swings, explosive anger, isolation, and an obsession with controlling others. By the late 1960s, Dean had begun drifting from job to job, eventually settling into a life that gave him privacy and access to vulnerable teenagers. Nobody knew it then. But Huston already had a serial killer hiding in plain sight. In 1970, teenage boys began disappearing across Houston Heights. Most came from working-class families. Some had difficult home lives, others were runaways. Police often assumed they had simply left town. Parents begged authorities to investigate, but many cases were ignored. Back then, missing teenage boys didn't receive the same attention as missing children today, especially boys from poorer neighborhoods. And Dean Corll understood that perfectly, because he wasn't hunting randomly. He was hunting the forgotten, the overlooked, the boys nobody expected to come home, one by one. They vanished, and nobody connected the cases. Not yet. Dean Corll rarely hunted alone. Instead, he recruited teenagers to help him. The first was David Brooks, a troubled teenager who admired Corll. Corll bought him gifts, alcohol, attention. Eventually, Brooks began helping lure boys to Corll's apartment, sometimes with promises of parties, sometimes drugs, sometimes simply friendship. Then came Elmer Henley, only a teenager himself. Henley later claimed he originally thought Corll was involved in a child trafficking ring. Not murder, but eventually he learned the truth, and still kept helping. Because by then, Corll controlled them through fear, manipulation, money, and threats. The three of them cruised Houston streets together, looking for victims, teenage boys, ages 13 to 20. Many willingly entered the car, never realizing they were riding toward death. Dean Corll's apartments changed often. But one thing stayed the same: a room prepared for torture. Inside was a plywood torture board. Victims were handcuffed or tied down. Some were sexually assaulted for hours, others for days. Investigators later discovered evidence of unimaginable cruelty: beatings, strangulation, glass rods, burning. Corll reportedly kept victims alive as long as possible, exerting total control over them. Neighbors occasionally heard screams, but Corll often explained them away as parties or drunken fights, and nobody looked deeper, because nobody wanted to believe a monster like this could exist nearby. After the torture ended, Corll murdered the boys, usually by strangulation or shooting. Then the bodies disappeared, buried in remote locations across Texas: boat sheds, forests, beaches, places where nobody would think to look. For 3 years, the killing continued, unstopped. One of the most disturbing parts of the Corll case is how avoidable it may have been. Families repeatedly reported missing sons. Neighbors noticed patterns. Teenagers whispered rumors about Dean Corll. Some boys even escaped encounters with him and described frightening experiences. But authorities failed to connect the disappearances. Houston police were overwhelmed, understaffed, and in some cases, dismissive. Many victims were labeled runaways without serious investigation. The idea of a serial killer targeting boys on such a massive scale seemed impossible, so the warnings were ignored. And Corll kept killing. Some investigators later faced accusations that they intentionally minimized the scope of the crimes, because admitting the truth would expose years of negligence. Even today, questions remain about how much authorities really knew, and whether opportunities to stop Corll were missed. August 8, 1973, the night Dean Corll lost control. That evening, Elmer Henley brought 2 friends to Corll's house: a teenage girl named Rhonda Williams and another young man. The situation quickly spiraled. Corll became furious. At some point during the night, Henley and the others were tied up. Corll intended to kill them too, but something changed. While Corll was distracted, Henley managed to free himself. The two argued. Then Corll reportedly said, "I can't go on, I'm going to kill you all." Seconds later, Henley grabbed a pistol and fired, again and again. And again, Dean Corll collapsed dead inside his own home. The Candyman killer was finally stopped, but the horror was only beginning, because police had no idea what waited inside that house. At first, police thought Henley's story sounded insane: serial murder, torture, mass graves. But then he led investigators to a boat shed in southwest Houston, and they started digging. The smell hit first, then human remains. Body after body emerged from the dirt, teenage boys stacked in shallow graves. The discovery horrified even veteran officers. And it didn't stop there. More burial sites were uncovered across Texas. By the end of the investigation, at least 28 victims were officially linked to Dean Corll, making him one of America's deadliest serial killers at the time. Parents flooded police stations searching for answers. Many finally learned what happened to sons missing for years. Others never received closure, because some victims were too decomposed to identify, and some were never found at all. Even investigators admitted they believed the true number could be much higher, possibly dozens more, lost forever beneath Texas soil. As shocking as the murders were, some people believe the real story was even darker. Critics accused Houston authorities of downplaying the case. Media coverage faded surprisingly quickly despite the scale of the killings. Questions emerged about whether officials wanted to avoid public outrage over how badly the disappearances had been mishandled. Others pointed to the uncomfortable truth that many victims were poor boys from difficult backgrounds. Boys society ignored. Some conspiracy theories even claimed Corll may have had connections to larger trafficking networks. Though no solid evidence ever proved this, still, the sheer number of missing boys connected to Corll remains terrifying, especially because several disappearances were never conclusively solved. Meaning somewhere out there, more victims may still remain undiscovered, hidden for over 50 years. Dean Corll died before facing justice. No trial. No confession in court. No full explanation for why he became a monster. Only graves and grieving families. His teenage accomplices spent decades in prison, but even today, the shadow of the Candyman still hangs over Huston. Because cases like this force us to confront a terrifying reality. Sometimes evil doesn't look frightening. Sometimes it smiles, offers candy, and waits quietly behind an ordinary door. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: if Elmer Henley had not pulled that trigger, how many more boys would have disappeared?